What is up, guys? So I have my fourth anatomy exam today, and I'm just going to be showing you guys how I'm planning on studying and maybe study with me too. So I got my notes here in front of me, so from the first day, and I got my book here in front of me too. Everything I need to study. I'm going to be showing you guys some pictures I'm going to be studying. Got a nice little lamp right there for some good lighting. Got my whiteboard here, so if there's any weak spots or weak points I am having trouble understanding, I'm going to be writing it on there. So let's jump in. So on the first day we started talking about the brain and how it separates humans from the animal world, particularly the cerebrum, or particularly the cerebral cortex. There's a convoluted capillary separating us from the other animals. There's about 5 or 6 regions of the brain. It gives us gigantic heads relative to our bodies. The brain has about 100 billion neurons, and most of the neurons in the brain have microscopically small processes. There's also microscopically small neurons and neuroglia, trillions of them. In the brain, the functional units of a neuron have a lot of diversity to it. Very few neurons are exact images of other neurons, coming in many different shapes and sizes. Some of them move at a slower rate. An example would be the cross-extensor reflex. Slower travel. The brain is a center for integration of information. The integration circuit takes information from a stimulus through an afferent pathway to the resting spinal cord. The central nervous system is where there might be a synapse to an interneuron and then another synapse to an efferent neuron. Then to an effector. In the brain, a stimulus matches with multiple responses that are connected with other stimuli. If you have an example would be if you have photons in your eye, it will go through a cranial nerve to a certain part of your brain where it will not only be connected to an outgoing effect but also a memory. A sight or image can be connected to a reflexive response. The simplest level of organization. A stimulus response, an association, associating what is happening at the current moment to what might have happened at a previous or another moment. Simplest associating responses. There's about 5 levels of brain integration. The simplest organization. Integrating gives humans the most basic level of consciousness, awareness, and awakeness. Integration gives us behavior, stimulus, response, and effects. It gives us emotional color, memory, intelligence, learning with color, learning with emotions. In order to learn, you must pair current experiences to a past experience. Relating something to a past experience. Okay, next day we did talk about the different figures on chapter 14. So here's a bit of an outline of what we're going through for this exam. We're going over embryonic/evolutionary development, brain structures and functions, the meninges and the blood supply, neural pathways to and from the brain, the sensory pathways to the brain, first, second, and third order neurons, motor pathways from the brain, pyramidal and extrapyramidal, brain structures and their functions, so the medulla, the pons, the cerebellum, the hypothalamus, the thalamus, the epithalamus, the limbic system, the reticular activating system, and states of consciousness. The cerebrum, which includes the sensory cortex, the motor cortex, association areas, and the prefrontal cortex. Cranial nerves and cranial reflexes. Okay. The first figure shows the regions of the brain and gives some of their functions. The brain allows us lots of different functions. The brain does some handing around of information. Consciousness. If you don't have a brain, you would not be aware of things. Your body may react differently. Emotions involve behaving, more parts of the brain affecting how you respond. Memory and emotions share certain brain parts in producing functions. Intelligence, higher intelligence, being able to recall and relay information from different sources. To see patterns in information, see exceptions to patterns. Examples, standardized tests. And then there's a table we have to look at. So this table shows the brain development from primary brain to secondary brain until your fully developed brain comes. Labeling, assigning a name to these categories. More sophisticated, taking what you have learned and making a prediction, forming some sort of conscience of what is right and wrong. Developmental stages of the brain include the prosencephalon, mesencephalon, rhombencephalon, so the front, middle, and back of the brain. The diencephalon includes the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. Prosencephalon, mesencephalon, rhombencephalon. The medulla oblongata is known for visceral control of autonomic centers, or regulation of visceral function. The medulla has a respiratory function in relation to respiratory centers in the medulla that keep you alive. It has a digestive function, a cardiac function, vascular function, heartbeat, contraction for force, blood vessel ability to constrict. It has 3 different locations. The pons and cerebellum. So the pons sends info to the cerebellum. It acts as a relay center. The pons is the big relay center to the cerebellum. It's involved in conscious and sometimes visceral motor control. The cerebellum is all about coordination of your skeletal responses. It needs input from the cerebral cortex, motor areas, combined with input from your sensory apparatus. The difference between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. The cerebrum is more about positioning. Careful positioning, tells you how far your arm would stretch, requiring you input through the pons. The midbrain adds a bunch of functions moving in the same direction. Breaks into areas of its own. The diencephalon includes the hypothalamus, which controls your basic emotions. things you are born with, such as rage, fear, contentment. There's an autonomic function to the hypothalamus with ADH hormone production, epinephrine, a hypothalamic force. Thermoregulation, so the body's acts as the body's. The hypothalamus can act as the body's thermostat. Hypothalamus is the thermometer. The thalamus is the relay, or more relaying than it does more relaying than processing. Filtering incoming relay sensor to filter info before reaching the cerebral cortex. It filters information before relaying it to an effector. The cerebrum includes our conscious thought processes and intellectual functions. Example, if you bump into the door, someone pinching your arm, you hitting them back. The cerebrum mainly does the coordination of incoming information and outgoing skeletal response. The stimulus response can be basic control. It can be basic or can involve lots of emotion and memory. So cerebrum coordinates with incoming information for skeletal response. So the cerebrum uses some memory into that action, and the hypothalamus is more on the emotions. The brainstem is something we don't really hear much with the rest of the animal kingdom. Okay, next figure. Next we're looking at this figure with the ventricles and the brain. Cerebrospinal fluid is sent up central canal into a ventricle and circulates into lateral ventricles. How does cerebrospinal fluid circulate without a pump? The central canal has cerebrospinal fluid that lies in a ventricle that goes into a passageway called the aqueduct. Makes up an opening in the back of your brain while houses the cerebrospinal fluid's brain version of a spinal cord in the central canal. Next figure. Next, we're looking at this figure. We have this learning more about the cerebrospinal fluid's role. Cushioning delicate neural structures, supporting the brain, and transporting nutrients, chemical messengers, and waste. That's some of the functions of the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. It has connections with the circulatory system. Ependymal cells line capillaries on the way to ventricle, hence the blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier. Ependymal cells have tiny cilia, or on their apical surface, allowing only small things to fit through, like a magic sieve. Cells such as pia mater become specialized cytoplasm. The cyanide ion goes into the cerebrospinal fluid. Ependymal cells are the magic sieve. Mature cerebrospinal fluid has ways of dumping waste into the bloodstream. Cerebrospinal fluid flows through ventricles and goes down spinal cord into central canal and back out the spinal cord to complete circulation. Hydrocephalus is the condition of infants having too much cerebrospinal fluid in the brain. Okay. So cerebrospinal fluid has an important function in cushioning neural structures, supporting the brain, transporting nutrients, chemical messengers, and waste products. And ependymal cells are part of that sieve or filter or protecting process, cleaning process, using their cilia. Okay, some important terms that were discussed. Proprioception is information about the position of skeletal muscles, tendons, and joints. Decussation, some impulses decussate at the cord. They enter the cord, the spinal cord, at the medulla, crossing over of information from right to left side of the body. The blood-brain barrier, unlike cerebrospinal fluid, has astrocytes surrounding the vessels. The brain does its best to keep itself isolated from the bloodstream. Things that are protected by these ependymal cells from entering the central nervous system include proteins, bacteria, and antibiotics. That's the purpose of these ependymal cells and astrocytes. So what can cross the blood-brain barrier without a lot of control? Gases, nonpolar molecules, lipids, lipid-based anesthetics, alcohols, caffeines cross the blood-brain barrier without much control. What is regulated, though, are proteins, antibiotics, chemical, and microbial toxins are excluded from neural tissue or controlled in their access. So polar molecules cannot enter the nervous system or neural tissue. The brain isn't red like the liver because it's the blood is controlled because it is full of cerebrospinal fluid protection. Now the next figure is very further up. Picture of the brain and the different nerves on it. Pathways on the white matter come from the brain. About proprioception that stretch receptors. Oh, there's my alarm. I'm already awake. Okay, there's a third. So the third pathway is proprioception, information about the position of skeletal muscles, tendons, and joints. Proprioceptors allow your brain to know your position even if your eyes are closed. All these have a bridge across the spinal cord. And more into brain development. So information going from pathways from receptor to an afferent. First order neurons going to a stimulus point to the central nervous system. From a stimulus point, receive their receptors to the central nervous system is sent using afferent first order neurons. First order neurons go into the spinal cord. Usually it has a cell body in its dorsal root ganglion. Second order neurons take information from the core or medulla from the first synapse point to the thalamus. Second order neurons go from the first synapse point in the central nervous system and up to the thalamus. The thalamus is information deciding what it wants you to be aware of and not be aware of. The cerebral cortex is well mapped as to which part of the cortex receives information. Third order neurons takes information from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. Information comes from the brain or central nervous system. First order neurons are on the return. Information tends to bypass the thalamus and into areas of the cerebellum. Pyramidal pathways are called direct pathways, willing something to happen. A lot is happening in your body even as you walk and swing your arms. Okay. 14. Next figure is of the medulla. All brain stems have functional layers. Respiratory centers, pneumotors located in nuclei on the medulla. Nuclei is connected by bulbs. There's neurons going to the respiratory muscles that need to go through cardiovascular centers and pneumotaxic centers. Next figure is of the pons. Medulla has regions that go through specific functions. From the posterior to the lateral view shows how the nuclei there are going through the medulla and is called the reticular formation. So the pons has a bit of the reticular formation going through it, as well as the medulla. Okay. Central sulcus. So this is the next figure I'm looking at. A bit of a dissection of an open brain. Central sulcus, the biggest fact, makes a frontal cut across the divides the sensory and motor halves of the brain. Central sulcus is the longitudinal fissure. Okay. The next day we had a quiz, and that's another thing I want to go over in this video. Some of the quiz questions we had previously to prepare for this exam today. So I'll just pull up some of the questions for you guys. So this was quiz number 7. So the question was, the diencephalon of the brain includes 3 brain structures. They are named the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. The epithalamus is not always mentioned, so just letting you guys know that. At what structures, no cell names, she didn't want cell names, does the cerebrospinal fluid enter the central nervous system from the blood? So, structures that uses to enter cerebrospinal fluid from the blood include the choroid plexus, choroid plexus is used for cerebrospinal fluid to enter the central nervous system from the blood. Where does the fluid leave the central nervous system to rejoin the blood? At using the venous sinus. What is the function of second order afferent neurons? I believe these are relay centers from the central nervous system, the brain, spinal cord to the thalamus. So the answer was carries information from the first synapse at the spinal cord to the thalamus, afferent story. And a third order neuron would be from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. Thalamus to the cerebral cortex. Okay. Fourth question, define decussation. So that's the transfer of information from left hemisphere of brain to right hemisphere. It is the movement of information between hemispheres in the brain, or it can travel from left to right hemisphere or from right to left hemisphere. Decussation is the crossing over of information crossing over neuron pathways from one side of the body to another side. Okay, back to our figure story. So let's start from the medulla. The medulla is the main connection between spinal cord and the rest of the brain. It's virtually everything that gets to the brain by going through the medulla. The medulla is the gateway to the rest of the brain. An exception would be the cranial nerves. So some of the functions of the medulla, it controls basic respiratory functions, DRG and VRG, nodes in the heart. But the medulla is mainly in charge in terms of hormones. Respiratory and circulatory system has its most basic settings in the medulla. It is the site of most decussation, coordinates autonomic reflexes. It has some cranial nerves that go into the medulla. It is the site of decussation. Okay, next one, the pons. The pons is the gateway to the cerebellum. Pons and the cerebellum work hand in hand. Nothing goes to the cerebellum without first going through the pons. It houses the cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8. It tells your skeletal muscles speed up or slow down, increase or decrease in your thoracic cavity. Brings a lot of sensory information combined with info from the cerebellum to be processed at the cerebral cortex. An example would be telling yourself to catch a fly ball. You use your cerebellum. Okay, onto the cerebellum picture. The cerebellum involves coordination, adjustment, fine-tuning, things we would use for sports. Combines incoming information from proprioceptors, which tells you the position of your skeletal muscles and joints. So you're going from proprioceptor to visual to tactile to balance to auditory receptors. So the pons is taking in the info and sending that to the cerebellum. So an example of this would be all these brain functions we can see ever so far. The cerebral cortex tells you want to catch your ball, say, and your pons and cerebellum hear the wind telling you how your muscles need to bend to catch that ball. And you're sitting on another example would be sitting on a horse and shooting at something moving. That's a crazy example of using your pons and cerebellum. So some important gateways. So the medulla is the gateway to the brain, that starting point. The pons is the gateway to the cerebellum, and the thalamus is the gateway to the cerebral cortex. Next figure, we have the thalamus. The thalamus is the gateway to the cerebral cortex. Determines information at cerebral cortex. It's the place that defines what sensory information is going to be projected on the cerebral cortex. The next day we talked about, still on the thalamus picture, the story about stimulus and exposure. Again, thalamus is gateway to cerebral cortex. Takes what comes in via first and second order neurons, and heads out via third order neurons, synapses in the thalamus, and neurons to the cerebral cortex. The cerebrum is more than just the cortex. Hypothalamus is emotion, cerebral cortex is the thinking part of the brain. Next brain structure we're going to talk about is the hypothalamus. So it's there's a picture for this. Yeah. The hypothalamus. Okay. It's an oval-shaped structure under the cerebrum. The lower in the brain under the thalamus. It has a pituitary gland, which is two parts in one. So the posterior part of the pituitary gland is responsible for secretion of ADH, antidiuretic hormone, dangling parts of the hypothalamus, heart of the hypothalamus. Some of the functions of the hypothalamus include controlling autonomic functions, mostly by regulating basic control. How is this different from the medulla? How does the hypothalamus work different from the medulla? The medulla basically keeps you alive. Control happens at the medulla. Puts more color on the control. Such as if you were excited, you would increase your blood pressure. Origination point for sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons. The hypothalamus hooks up with the somatic nervous system and the autonomic. Takes emotions and memories, setting them off into muscle movements. Movements we're not aware we are doing. An example would be facial expressions. Subconscious, moving skeletal muscles in response to emotional stimuli. Linking conscious thoughts to visceral smooth muscle activity. An example of being worried, smooth muscles in the stomach respond in response to autonomic nervous system. We have conscious control, smooth muscles responding to sympathetic and parasympathetic cues, which link up via hypothalamus to autonomic nervous system. Conscious thoughts can affect visceral and autonomic function. Produces basic emotional drives, thirst, hunger, sex drives, nurturing, rage, fear. Okay, a bit more on the parts of the hypothalamus, in terms of the pituitary gland. Posterior pituitary gland hooks up with hypothalamus, also called the neural hypophysis. And the anterior pituitary gland is, another name for that would be the adenohypophysis. The different emotions and drives, basic drives we have at our hypothalamus, shows their effect through hormones, all these drives, such as ADH production by the hypothalamus, secreted by the posterior pituitary, and can affect thirst, affecting basic drives. Oxytocin too. The posterior pituitary gland secretes ADH and oxytocin. The hypothalamus produces and secretes a whole set of hormones called releasing hormones. Produces and secretes into anterior pituitary gland or adenohypophysis. Controls growth and reproduction. Regulates body temperature, has access to thermoreceptors. The hypothalamus regulates body temperature, access to thermoreceptors. Heating the body's core, housed in the hypothalamus. There's oxygen and pH receptors that link up to the circulatory system occurring in the hypothalamus to do something about it. A question she asked the class: what is the main way to get rid of core body temperature? Dilate peripheral blood vessels. This is the part of the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, dilation of peripheral blood vessels. Next figure, the limbic system. So memory and stuff like that. So the hypothalamus doesn't just work in isolation, it works with the limbic system too. Includes the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And the reticular formation. The limbic system is more about the subconscious brain level, being aware of emotions, but you are not dictating them consciously. It's about memory storage and retrieval. The limbic system works with the help from cerebral cortex and is stored in different areas of the brain and is recalled at deeper levels than from the limbic system. It is a center for emotion. It plays a role in emotional drive. The epithalamus is one of the three components of the diencephalon. Hypothalamus, thalamus. Besides hypothalamus and the thalamus, there is the epithalamus. In the back of it is the pineal gland, or the endocrine gland. Endocrine gland secretes the hormone melatonin. Melatonin is responsible for basic behaviors, migration, breeding, wake cycles in animals, humans, sleep and wakefulness. Epi means outside of the thalamus. The reticular formation is in the previous picture. I'll show you guys. So you can see the reticular formation in this figure from the pons view. It's an orange little noodle thing going in through there. The reticular formation covers everything from the medulla to the pons, processing of incoming and outgoing stuff. On top of it is the RES, reticular activating system, which is a system of connecting information projected through the thalamus and sends to your RES. Gets cerebral cortex, getting your cerebral cortex aroused. What is the difference between your RES and the thalamus? RES takes input from the lower brain, sends to cerebral cortex to ready it to receive certain stimuli. It's all about arousing the brain. Pulls in information through the thalamus, telling the brain to ready itself. Okay. Talk a little bit about brain waves. Okay, brain waves. The brain can be in a state of non-readiness, slow waves to deep sleep. An example would be a dog barking and you wouldn't know it. The brain's readiness to receive a stimulus. Shorter wavelength equals higher frequencies. High frequency, there's shorter wavelength means you have high frequencies. High frequencies means you have more readiness for your brain to receive a stimulus. The next figure, back to the cerebral cortex, motor and sensory regions of the cerebral cortex, such as your primary motor region, prefrontal cortex, primary sensory cortex, somatic sensory cortex, your association areas, visual and auditory association areas, and your somatic motor and sensory association areas. All of these areas are important to understand in terms of the cerebral cortex. So there's different motor and sensory regions in your cerebral cortex. Motor responses in the cerebral cortex, going through somatic nervous system to stimulate skeletal muscles. The cerebral cortex talking to your skeletal muscles does not use your hypothalamus to do this. Information from the hypothalamus gets projected onto the primary somatosensory sulcus. Every sense has their own association area where the info from the primary cortex is sent to be associated with other association areas. So there's a primary motor and sensory cortex, and there's a somatic motor and sensory association areas. Okay. And they're all in different lobes of the brain. Integrating information received from many association areas allows us to recognize an object visually and makes an association with it. Associations are made using memories and the naming systems that get involved. Cerebral cortex is not bilaterally symmetry. It's as lateralization, so different sides of the brain can have some specialization. An example would be the left hemisphere involved with analytical reasoning, ordering the piece of a whole, sequential ordering. An example would be serial processing of a computer. Similarity to the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is involved with the whole picture rather than pieces of the picture, more on imagination, patterns, perception. Artists use their right-sided skills more than their left. If you are without some small functions from either side of the brain, our world changes. So information, again, traveling from the thalamus is third order neuron. Thalamus, the cerebral cortex, to be more alerted. Primary sensory cortex, or postcentral gyrus, is projected to various association areas. Projection to the deeper areas, association in the frontal lobe. Okay, another figure. Deeper areas of integration function, so we can see the different fibers here. Back into this one. Bounces onto the prefrontal cortex. So this is what we do best as humans. It's where humans evaluate, judge, predict, and take information from past resources, libraries, and make sense of what has come in. Working with old info and making new info. It's like a library. It's a deeper cortex, includes emotions, memories, limbic system, similar to our limbic system, the cortex, and subcerebral cortex. Information to integrative areas, sensory and motor, to the deeper cerebrum. Like a circuit, ends up in motor areas for association areas, then goes deeper into integrative areas of us to motor parts of the brain. Comes from the premotor cortex, primary motor cortex. The mix-up in that name, or precentral gyrus. There's two names for primary motor cortex, precentral gyrus. Last place before information heads to the first order neuron. It goes into integration and motor areas of the nervous system. So it would be going from the association areas. After we get information to primary motor cortex or primary sensory cortex, we bring them to association areas. Then we bring them to integration areas in the motor region. Integration areas. Then to the motor region. Then to associated to a new neuron in the motor region, then to the primary motor cortex. Primary motor cortex. Then it goes to an effector from there. Okay, so now we're at my most previous class. So we had a quiz on this one also. So first question, which regions of the brain house the centers for respiratory function, and what is the difference between their two effects on respiration? So there's the medulla and the pons. The medulla does more on respiration based on. Let me see. I know I went over this. It uses the medulla is stimulates the respiratory system based on your emotions. Emotions and memories affect this. And for the pons, there's DRG and VRG there. Let me see if I can find anything. Yeah, I usually, what I would do is after class I would usually edit my notes so that I would be able to go over them before exam days and have a lot more information there. In case I missed anything. I know I went over the, okay. The pons, it's apneustic and pneumataxic centers such as DRG and VRG, which are used for altering respiratory rate. Because the pons is constantly receiving information about O2 using these pneumataxic centers and apneustic centers. Okay, the second question on the quiz this week was give the two types of information from two places that affect the cerebellum's output. So that would be the primary motor and sensory cortex. Yeah. Cerebral cortex and cerebral senses, proprioception. Motor responses. Cerebral cortex and cerebral senses. I'm just adding the new information in for this answer because there was a bit of a mistake. It was just motor responses here. Number 3, give the two types of information from. Give the two functions of the hypothalamus briefly. So temperature regulation. So there's thermoreceptors on the hypothalamus, and it also controls emotions. Memories should be memories. So I have secretes hormones, Two parts of this hormone story include the direct story telling the pituitary gland to secrete hormones, and the indirect part of the hypothalamus story, limbic system, emotions, motivation, and memory. Subconscious level of function is conducted to skeletal and smooth. It's connected to skeletal and smooth muscles, aware of things but not willing them. Being aware of things but not willing them. Subconscious level. Next question: where in the cortex are motor responses from? Just before they journey to the efferent pathway. Association areas. The primary motor cortex, or the precentral gyrus. Incoming info comes from postcentral gyrus. Postcentral gyrus. Primary sensory. So information comes in using primary sensory cortex or postcentral gyrus, and leaves to efferent to an effector using the primary motor cortex or precentral gyrus. Okay, that makes sense. Sensing it in a motor, leading it to an effector. And then we moved on to the next chapter already. So an important part of this exam is also we're going to be talking about the different nerves and the different reflexes. So I need to study a bit of this. The different kinds of cranial reflexes and the types of nerves that are stimulated. Just go over some of them. Corneal reflex, contact with the corneal surface, uses the trigeminal nerve, nerve number 5. I have a strange mnemonic for remembering all the cranial nerves. O to touch and feel. O to touch and feel green vegetables. Let me go over that. O to touch and feel green vegetables. O to touch and feel very green vegetables. Heavens. Okay. And there's a bit of a table here. So corneal reflex uses the trigeminal nerve. Trigeminal is more associated with the jaws. Response is the blinking of the eyes. The tympanic reflex is for loud noise. It uses the vestibulocochlear nerve for reduced movement of auditory ossicles. Auditory reflexes uses also vestibulocochlear for eye and head or movements triggered by sudden sounds opposite of eyes to stabilize field of vision. Visceral reflexes, direct light reflexes, uses direct light, light striking photoreceptors. So there's 2 divisions for cranial reflexes. There's somatic reflexes and visceral reflexes based on this figure. Both are optic. Both use the optic nerve for visceral. So there's a direct light reflex and consensual light reflex. One is for constriction of the pupil, or both are for constriction of different parts of the pupil. For this exam, I'm probably going to go with corneal because that's easy to remember. Your corneas uses so blinking of eyelids uses trigeminal nerve, so more on the ophthalmic side, or more on the maxillary side, your lower eyelid. I'd probably use tympanic and auditory. Tympanic noise, corneal eye, auditory reflex also noise, vestibulocochlear and trigeminal nerves. Yeah, those are the cranial nerves, cranial reflexes I need to remember for this exam. I need to add them to my study guide. Okay, back onto notes. First figure we're talking about comparing autonomic and somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system has, of course, two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. There's an efferent side of the story, the output side. There's an input end of the story, afferent information traveling efferently through the autonomic nervous system from visceral receptors as opposed to special receptors and somatic receptors. Respond to visual cues so that some autonomic output efferents start out as efferent information and somatic sensory information. Visceral receptors take the form of chemoreceptors. So there's the autonomic nervous system. Okay. I'm just studying the picture right now. Visceral receptors take the form of chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors which gets info about pH, carbon dioxide, protein levels. Osmoreceptors and mechanoreceptors that form the baroreceptors, stretch receptors. The brain story adds up information from the subconscious thoughts, things that we're aware of but we cannot will, and subconscious emotional drives. Input comes from many places. The visceral part, the digestive tract. So autonomic nervous system story. Visceral part, chemoreceptors. The digestive tract is told by chemoreceptors that something is happening, telling it to start pancreatic secretions. Emotions affect visceral response. Conscious thoughts. Having a test today affects visceral response, pancreatic secretion. Motor responses. So I'm probably having a lot of pancreatic secretion, who knows. Motor response, excitatory or inhibitory response. So we just discussed the input side of the story, the visceral part. Now we're going into motor response, excitatory, inhibitory response. Integrated. Where does the sensory input go to? It goes to the spinal cord as far as visceral reflexes, integrated processes in the spinal cord. So autonomic nervous system versus somatic nervous system. Sends out info from precentral gyrus. Precentral, so that's the primary motor cortex to an effector. Upper motor neurons, first order neurons, pyramidal and extrapyramidal pathway synapse at some point in the nervous system, so somatic. Ends up always at skeletal muscles. Information comes down to synapses in the cerebrum, hypothalamus. For the autonomic nervous system, before the difference between somatic and autonomic nervous system is somatic goes straight to skeletal muscle innervation, but autonomic nervous system goes straight to autonomic ganglion, preganglionic neuron, then to effectors such as smooth muscles, glands, cardiac muscles, and adipocytes, adipose tissue. Sympathetic versus parasympathetic version of a ganglia. Next figure. This is the next figure we're going to be looking at. It's a comparison of somatic and autonomic function. In the different pathways. So we're starting at the cerebral, or we get our sensory receptors, of course, getting information, and that information goes to sensory pathways. Then we go into relay and processing centers in the brain stem. It then can go through two directions. If it was visceral sensory receptors, it goes to hypothalamus. If it's somatic sensory, it goes to the thalamus. At this point, we're already in the central nervous system. Then we reach the cerebral cortex. Then from there, we can either go, if it's a somatic nervous system response, it goes down to the lower motor neurons, back to the peripheral nervous system, the somatic nervous system innervating the skeletal muscles. If it's not somatic, then we go to the limbic system, down to the hypothalamus again, and then down to a preganglionic neuron, then to the autonomic nervous system, and then to visceral effectors. On this sensory pathway, you can if it's a reflex, of course, you only go straight to the spinal cord after you sense it for a quick response. An example would be once you sense it, once your sensory receptors pick it up, if you do a short reflex, it goes straight to the visceral effectors, skipping the autonomic nervous system innervation. Another way you can go is through sensory pathways. If it's a somatic reflex, it goes straight to the somatic nervous system, innervating skeletal muscles. If it's a long reflex, it goes to autonomic nervous system, innervating visceral effectors such as cardiac muscles, smooth muscles, adipose tissue, things like those. So some reflexes don't even get into the nervous system. The thalamus is the relaying and processing center in the brainstem, of course. Receptors include sensory, visceral, and somatic, special sensory. Okay, next figure. Here's the next figure we're looking at. This one, summary of the anatomical differences between the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. So, as you can see from this figure, on the central nervous system part of the sympathetic, the preganglionic neuron is much shorter than the preganglionic neuron for the parasympathetic. The preganglionic fiber is much shorter. Preganglionic fiber for parasympathetic much longer. It's about 2 ganglionic neurons in the sympathetic, only 1 in the parasympathetic. The sympathetic ganglion there, parasympathetic ganglion there, and as you can see, it uses different neurotransmitters. The sympathetic division uses both epinephrine and norepinephrine that affect the bloodstream. Notice how there's no bloodstream affected here. And the parasympathetic division uses mainly acetylcholine. Actually, there's some acetylcholine in the sympathetic division, but it only comes off of the preganglionic fiber. And then each one both innervate a target, which could be, for sympathetic, could be blood vessel, constrictor neurodilation, parasympathetic adipose tissue, smooth muscle, cardiac muscles, glands, things like those. And also the postganglionic fiber for the sympathetic division is much longer, and for the parasympathetic division, the postganglionic fiber is much shorter. So there's some anatomical differences between the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Parasympathetic has no chain ganglia. Sympathetic has chain ganglia. So they use different neurotransmitters. Parasympathetic uses acetylcholine and acetylcholine. Sympathetic uses acetylcholine and norepinephrine or epinephrine, but they're still technically considered one epinephrine. Let's go with that. Normal reflexes go into the spinal cord to be integrated and then back out. Somatic info comes from the cerebral cortex. Bloodstream differences. Blood vessels constrict and dilation is controlled only by the sympathetic division. Okay, some functional differences. So into this big picture here, let's just stare at it for a while. Sympathetic division. That fell on me. Sympathetic division versus. Dang, this is a big page. Sympathetic division versus parasympathetic division. Notice how they're both innervating organs. Both have preganglionic neurons, ganglia, and they all go to a target organ. The difference between the different organ here, sympathetic can innervate skin, parasympathetic does not. Parasympathetic also innervates lacrimal glands in the eye, causing you to cry. Sympathetic division has a chain. This parasympathetic does not have a chain. Chain ganglia. Then we talked a bit about the eye. So it's a figure, we drew a big pictures of the eye, the pupil, and the iris. The pupil has a lack of an iris, the front of the lens. And there's a hole in the middle. To contract, the muscles in the pupil must open. Muscles in the iris are contracting and not contracting. The iris has a central circle, surface muscle, and median muscle. Constricts which, if it was to constrict, which dilates? Which muscle dilates on the iris? The concentric circle, surface muscle, or the radiating muscle? The answer is the radiating muscle. In order to dilate the iris, the radiating muscle is constricted. Dual innervation is a common theme in the autonomic nervous system. If you constrict its circular muscles, it means you're making your pupil smaller. Do pupils dilate or constrict under sympathetic innervation? They dilate. Parasympathetic. Salivary gland, sympathetic versus parasympathetic. Normal digestive function increases from which innervation? Normal innervative function is increased based on parasympathetic division. Normal innervation is increased based on parasympathetic division. Occurs based on parasympathetic innervation. We stimulate sympathetic nervous system. Digestive organs. To allow blood flow, reduce sympathetic innervation. Dilation. Parasympathetic is not affecting blood vessels. Blood flow to the digestive organs increases how? Lowering sympathetic innervation. If you have sympathetic innervation of blood vessels, your blood vessels are constricting, narrowing of blood vessels. Blood flow increases when digesting by picking off on sympathetic innervation. Digestion does not allow blood flow. Sympathetic innervation does not affect these blood vessels. The lungs, the bronchioles, one increases and another decreases bronchioles. Skin. The autonomic nervous system on the skin is only done by sympathetic nervous system. Has some blood flow, temperature control, erector pili muscle, hair raises, all under sympathetic innervation. Okay, and the different types of functional differences of the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Different structures: eye, skin, cardiovascular system, endocrine system, respiratory system, digestive system, skeletal muscles, urinary system, reproductive system, all the different muscles there. And what they do based on different innervations of sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic does a lot of things. Parasympathetic also does a lot of things, but parasympathetic does not affect sweat glands, erecti pili muscles, blood vessels. Parasympathetic has no effect on these. Yeah. So you have to understand this table. Blood vessels of all only sympathetic effect happens here. Okay. Skeletal muscles are only innervated by a somatic nervous system. Autonomic reflexes make you swallow. I accidentally put some autonomic somatic nervous system. Acetylcholine is released by a sarcoplasmic reticulum, activates muscle activity. Sympathetic increases blood flow, facilitates skeletal muscle contraction in limbs. Sympathetic division of the somatic nervous system increases blood flow, increases metabolic processes, facilitates skeletal muscle contraction, pumps out skeletal muscle contraction. Okay, onto the visceral reflexes, the short versus long reflexes. Visceral reflexes have the same basic components as somatic reflexes, but all visceral reflexes are polysynaptic. Note that short visceral reflexes bypass the central nervous system altogether. Okay. Okay, short versus long reflexes, visceral reflexes. Autonomic goes through the spinal cord, parasympathetic reflex has lots of them. Coughing, urination, defecation. So in this figure, we start with a stimulus. Goes to receptors through afferent sensory fibers to the dorsal root ganglion to the central nervous system. So this is a long reflex right here. If it's a long reflex, it goes through the central nervous system, to the processing centers in the spinal cord, then to autonomic ganglion, sympathetic or parasympathetic, using a preganglionic neuron, then to a postganglionic neuron to a peripheral effector. If it's a short reflex, you're going from a receptor to sensory fibers to straight to the effector. You don't need to go through the processing centers or autonomic ganglion to decide if you're sympathetic or parasympathetic response. It's just straight to an effector using afferent sensory fibers for short. Or actually, you do have to go through for short reflexes. You do have to go through an autonomic ganglion before reaching, and a postganglionic neuron before reaching your effector. Either way, both reflexes, short or long, have to go through a postganglionic neuron and a postganglionic and an autonomic ganglion to decide if it's going to be a sympathetic or parasympathetic response. So you know the parasympathetic and sympathetic reflexes for this exam. These are some of the reflexes we need to know. So parasympathetic reflexes, defecation, urination, gastric and intestinal reflexes, swallowing, coughing, arousal, sympathetic reflexes, cardiac saltatory reflexes, basal reflex, pupillary reflex, things like those. Okay? And we need to know the cranial nerves for the Roman numerals for the cranial nerves, what they are, sensory or motor. She wants a short description of their function and knowing one sensory and one motor function. So I'm going to be studying some of the notes I made on an online document. I'll see if I can make a video of that. I'm surprised I didn't use my whiteboard for this study session, and I still have about an hour before my my exam starts. So let's hope for the best, and let's see if I can get to another video for my online study guide for you guys. See you in the next one. Peace. Best of luck on your exams.